tourist town becomes a death trap for 3 vacationing women. Investigators must link the suspect to the crime scene, or their case will be dead in the water. During her abduction, a woman is shot on videotape. Can the blurry image help detectives zoom in on her killer? A murder case rests on 2 computer disks that have been cut to ribbons. Now, investigators must invent a way to assemble their evidence bit by bit. Every phone call can be followed. Every transaction leaves a trace. Most of us never give it a second thought. But when a crime occurs, technology becomes an electronic witness. On June 4th, 1989, investigators in Tampa, Florida found themselves plunged into the depths of a mystery. At 9:30 in the morning, boaters discovered a body floating in Tampa Bay. Its hands were tied behind its back. Duct tape covered the nose and mouth. The victim was naked from the waist down. The Coast Guard arrived to recover the body. They cut it free of a weight that dangled below the surface. The victim was female. As they carried her to shore, another call came in. A second body had surfaced 7 miles away. Like the first, she was bound and apparently raped. She was also thrown in alive. It was clearly a victim of the same killer. St. Petersburg detective Sindra Cummings worked the case.
This body, the second one, also had a yellow nylon rope tied around her neck. There was another female nude from the waist down. The end of the rope around her neck was tied to a 2-cell cement block. Her feet were tied together. Her hands were tied at one point, but we believe she struggled and she was able to get her hands free in the water before she died.
The killer hadn't finished. No sooner had the second body been recovered than a third victim surfaced 200 yards away, killed in the same manner. The triple homicide in the water sent out ripples of activity. Police boats scoured Tampa Bay for more victims. Divers descended to the bottom. But no more bodies were found. That was the good news. The bad news was that the killer left no immediate clues. He was still out there, somewhere.
Whoever killed these women had to be some kind of a monster.
The autopsy revealed the 3 women had been dead between 2 and 3 days, giving their killer ample time to flee. Each died from lack of oxygen, either from the tape across their noses and mouths, the rope around their necks, or by drowning. The horror of the crime was compounded by the anonymity of the victims. In a tourist spot like Tampa, people come and go every day. The victims could have come from anywhere. The case was heavily publicized, hoping that someone who knew the victims would come forward. Hundreds of leads poured in. 60 detectives were assigned to follow up. Not one lead panned out. Meanwhile, 1,100 miles away in Van Wert County, Ohio, a dairy farmer named Hal Rogers grew anxious. His wife, Jo, and daughters Michelle and
I'm really
Christy
excited
were
about the
vacationing
trip,
in Florida.
But I wish Dad could come. Why can't he?
It was their first time off the farm.
You know someone's got to stay on
The
the
girls
farm.
had never been to the ocean before and were very excited. But Hal couldn't escape his obligations at the farm and had to send his family without him. Their last postcard was dated 11 days earlier, and they hadn't called in a week. He knew something was wrong. While Hal Rogers contemplated a trip to Florida to look for his family, a maid at a Tampa hotel had suspicions of her own. For 7 days, she returned to the same room to clean it, but found that the occupants hadn't slept in the beds or even opened a bar of soap.
I never saw anybody.
Nobody at all.
The publicity surrounding the murdered women was fresh in her mind. Wondering if there were a connection, she told her manager about the room. He notified the police. The room was registered to Jo Rogers. She had arrived with 2 children. Forensics dusted for fingerprints. One set was positively identified as one of the murder victims. Identification was difficult because the bodies were so decomposed when found. But investigators at last had something to work with. On the hotel registration, Rogers had listed her vehicle. The car wasn't in the parking lot. Tampa police spread out to locate it. They found it parked at a boat ramp 2.5 miles from the hotel. Forensics combed every inch of it for clues. They found a tourist brochure. On the back were handwritten directions to their hotel. The penmanship was compared against Jo's, Christie's, and Michelle's. It didn't match. It was apparently written by someone they met on the road. To investigators, this meant only that they became lost and asked someone for directions. It was hardly a lead. A tourist's life is full of such brief interactions with strangers. That's precisely why investigators were so troubled by this case. The killer, too, was no doubt a stranger to the victims, and crimes committed by strangers are the hardest to solve because nothing connects victim to killer.
It could be anyone from the entire Tampa Bay population that we were concerned about. And it had everyone in Tampa Bay area concerned and worried because the victims were just tourists, someone that everyone can identify with. They weren't in a drug area, they weren't doing anything illegal or anything wrong, and here they were singled out and victimized by an unknown person. And we had no leads to the suspect, nothing to start with.
Investigators also found a sheet of hotel stationery with directions to the boat ramp. They included the words blue with white. Because the directions were to the boat ramp and the women were killed on the water, detectives assumed the words described the killer's boat. It also described hundreds of other boats in Tampa Bay. Investigators determined that the handwriting on the stationery matched Jo Rogers. The killer must have visited or phoned her at the hotel and dictated them. But no one had seen him, and the hotel didn't keep a log of incoming calls. The ferocity of the crime told police that the killer probably had a prior record. More than likely, he worked his way up to murder through a series of smaller crimes. But without further leads, the investigation stagnated. Months rolled by as waves of suspects arose and were eliminated. In October, 4 months after the murders, investigators received a bulletin about a rape that occurred on a boat at Madeira Beach, 2 weeks before the Rogers were killed. The victim was a tourist. Madeira Beach was only 10 miles from the murder scene. Sergeant Glenn Moore says the similarities between this case and the Rogers rape and murder didn't stop there.
The suspect in the Madeira Beach case had threatened to use duct tape on the mouth of one of the victim on the Madeira Beach rape case, and that was what was used on our victims. He also threatened this woman with dying. Was it worth dying for? And he also had a blue and white boat.
The victim gave police a description of the rapist.
His eyes were sunken, very sunken.
Besides his blue and white boat, she also remembered that her attacker drove a dark four-wheel drive vehicle with tinted windows. A composite of her attacker's face was published in the papers.
That's it. Yeah,
Tips flooded in.
I'm sure.
Months passed as detectives chased every lead that could connect a suspicious stranger to the victims. It came to nothing. By now, almost a year had passed, and all they had was a picture of a rapist who may or may not be the killer. Without any promising leads in the Tampa Bay triple homicide, Sergeant Glenn Moore reviewed the evidence collected so far. He had a composite sketch with no ID and a brochure with directions to the hotel written in a stranger's hand. The brochure was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab in Tampa and processed to reveal fingerprints. It held some prints that didn't belong to any of the victims. They were analyzed by latent print examiner Sam McMullen.
There's what we call, or refer to sometimes as writer's palm, and that's when you're writing a document the way that your hand, the palm of your hand falls on the document itself.
A palm print is just as conclusive as a fingerprint in making an ID. Whoever left these prints wrote the directions on the brochure. Now detectives wondered if this same person possibly killed the Rogers. If this writer were the killer, his fingerprints were probably on file for prior offenses. Although palm prints become part of a repeat offender's record, they aren't usually cataloged in the computerized fingerprint system. Investigators had no way of doing an automated search. All they could do was manually compare the print against each new suspect that surfaced. More time slipped by without a match. The prints and the writing sample seemed useless. Moore wouldn't let the investigation die. The man who killed the Rogers was at large, and police were determined to find him. To flush him out, they held press conferences, posted billboards.
And typically what happens is you put up a picture of the victims and you say, does anybody know anything about this case? I think what was a little bit different and unique about what we did with the billboards is we actually put a picture of the handwriting evidence up on the billboard and asked people to look at that and tell us if they knew who the handwriter was.
Among the deluge of leads, one stood out. A woman named Joanne Steffi told police that the handwriting looked like a former neighbor's, an aluminum siding contractor named Oba Chandler. She had seen the composite when it first appeared and thought it resembled Chandler. But she wasn't sure. The handwriting rekindled her suspicions.
When we put the handwriting up on the billboards and it brought it back to her attention, she went and checked with some other neighbors and some other people and found some contracts for the business he was in. She made the visual comparison herself along with her neighbors, and they decided it was a great likelihood this was the writer, so they gave us a call.
The contracts and brochure were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where they were scrutinized by document examiner Teresa Stubbs.
The examination of handwriting is really a study of movement. You're looking at all the aspects of the writing, the beginning strokes, the ending strokes,
the height relationships of letters to other letters. Once I had familiarized myself with all those habits that were on the brochure, then I compared them with the habits found in the known sample of writing submitted as being that of Mr. Chandler. I found that they were significantly similar in all aspects with no differences.
The handwriting match was the break the detectives needed. A little more digging, and investigators found that 45-year-old Oba Chandler had a long criminal record, having been charged with everything from burglary and counterfeiting to kidnapping. Police obtained his palm prints from his prison records. The print found on the brochure matched Oba Chandler's right hand. They had their suspect. Now they had to build their case.
And how are you?
Detectives arranged a photo lineup with the Madeira Beach rape victim, asking if she could identify the man who attacked her.
In these particular photographs.
She selected Oba Chandler's picture.
Right here.
More confident than ever that Chandler was the murderer, Sergeant Moore kept him under surveillance to see if he would tip his hand. He didn't. And they didn't have enough to arrest him. To prove he killed the Rogers, they had to place him at the scene of the crime. The waters of Tampa Bay held no clues, but maybe the answer was in the air. Detectives sought his phone records to see if they could trace his whereabouts. Chandler's phone records showed that on the night of the murders, June 1st, 1989, 5 calls were made between 1:30 and 5 a.m. The prefixes showed that these calls were shipped to shore, made collect to his home.
They were extremely important. They put Oba Chandler on his boat the night of the killings, the night that the women were murdered and thrown into the bay. We could prove that Oba Chandler was on his boat.
At his trial, Chandler said he'd been fishing on the bay that night when his engine failed. He told the jury that his fuel line broke, and by the time he fixed it with duct tape, he'd lost all his gas. He was stranded until a passing boat rescued him the next morning. But the jury didn't buy his fish story. On cross-examination, Chandler couldn't explain why he called home but didn't call a towing service. He couldn't describe where the fuel line enters the engine. He didn't realize that duct tape doesn't stick to a gas-covered fuel line. And most importantly, he didn't know his engine had an anti-siphon valve, making it impossible for the gas to leak out if the line burst.
I believe that was one of the defining moments for the jury, to see him on the stand and to see all of what he said proven wrong.
The prosecution presented a more credible scenario.
Excuse me, sir. Do you know how to get to the Viking Hotel?
Yeah, which one?
Lost in Tampa, Jo Rogers and her daughters stopped to ask directions to their hotel. The friendly stranger who showed them the way was Oba Chandler. Now he knew where they were staying. He may have called them shortly after they checked in, inviting them to watch the setting sun from aboard his boat. Jo jotted down the directions, and off they went. There was no time to unpack. When they arrived at the pier, Chandler was there to greet them. They boarded the boat, never suspecting this was to be their last sunset. For his crimes, Oba Chandler was sentenced to death. Oba Chandler didn't care who he killed. Most murderers are more selective. The road to their conviction begins with a motive. In Northumberland County in central Pennsylvania, a young girl returned home from her grandparents' house. She'd walked this path dozens of times, and her mind was a million miles away. But on June 12, 1989, the foul smell of decay caught her attention. She cautiously investigated, hoping it wasn't a dog struck by a car. What she found was far worse, a human body.
How long ago?
Pennsylvania State Police rushed in to document the scene before the body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. Every homicide investigation begins with three questions. Who's the victim? When did the murder take place? And who did it? District Attorney Robert Sakavage, now a district judge, searched for answers.
We could not get a quick identification. We had to use scientific techniques. We had to get a forensic odontologist to examine the teeth and so forth for that purpose. Also, we were interested in finding what the time of death was.
The warm weather had taken its toll. There wasn't much left to collect. All that the police could tell was that the victim was female. She didn't easily surrender information about her death. Her clothing provided the first clue. County Coroner Richard Ulrich analyzed the remains.
The clothing was removed, and upon being removed was displayed and was examined further, and at this point in time it was felt that she suffered repeated stab wounds to the back through the clothing, which indicated blunt force sharp injury.
Next, the insect life colonizing the body was examined. The life cycles of flies and beetles can be used to estimate the time of death. The longer a body sits, the more generations of insects it nourishes. It was determined that the victim was killed between 19 and 25 days earlier. The dental records identified the victim as Lori Ocker, who had disappeared 19 days before, on May 24th. Lori Ocker and her son had moved back in with her parents after separating from her husband. She was last seen leaving home at 3:30 for her job at a pet store in the mall. By 4 o'clock, she hadn't arrived at work. Her boss phoned her home to see where she was.
She left for work
Her mother was
a
concerned.
half hour ago.
She should have been there already. Thinking her car may have broken down, her parents retraced her route. They saw no sign of her until they arrived at the mall. Her car was parked near the entrance, but no trace of Lori was found until her body was recovered 19 days later. For almost 3 weeks, Lori Ocker was considered a missing person. But now her case was turned over to homicide, and attention shifted to finding her killer. Lori's mother told police that Lori had received threats from her estranged husband, Robert Ocker. The couple had been battling over custody of their son. Lori had been so afraid of Robert that she kept a shotgun under her bed for protection. He became the prime suspect. Shortly after Lori disappeared, police had questioned Robert Ocker. He told investigators that he'd been out running errands in his Plymouth Caravelle. He hadn't seen Lori. His parents, questioned later, agreed that he'd been out, but said he'd driven his mother's car, a 1984 Chevy Celebrity. At the time, the inconsistency meant nothing to investigators. Robert may have been lying because he wasn't covered on the Chevy's insurance. To prove Robert's involvement, they'd have to place him at the scene of the abduction. Police went to the mall to see if anyone had seen anything suspicious. They spoke to a teller at the bank next to the mall entrance. She suggested that perhaps the tape from the automatic teller machine held some clue, since it captured the portion of the parking lot where the victim parked her car.
Well, I don't remember seeing it, but...
An ATM camera snaps still images onto videotape at preset intervals. The camera at the mall where Ocker disappeared took a picture every 10 seconds. Lori Ocker had been missing 5 days by the time investigators were able to obtain the tape. The image, fuzzy but undeniable, was Ocker's car. Next to it was a figure, assumed to be Ocker. It was the next image, taken 10 seconds later, that caught investigators' attention.
The picture was not clear. The focus of the camera was on a person who was negotiating a transaction with the machine. Over his shoulder, deeper into the parking lot, was what we believe a scene of abduction.
The image showed a car crossing the victim's path. She's leaning into the car. In the next frame, the car is driving away, and Lori is gone. The car, though ghost-like, vaguely resembled the Chevy owned by Robert Ocker's mother. Robert Ocker was a suspect by virtue of the fact that he and Lori parted on such hostile terms. Lori feared for her life, but it appeared that Robert had managed to lure her into the car.
At the time of this abduction, Robert Ocker was exercising his first weekend of visitation, and he had in his custody the child. We absolutely have no statements to that effect, but circumstantially, we know that how devoted she was to that child. Is there any conceivable reason she would have gone into the car? Probably. If somebody would have told her that something was wrong with her child or she was needed, she might do it for that reason.
Investigators faced two obstacles linking the car to the homicide. First, the image on the ATM was too blurry to conclusively prove it was the Chevrolet. And second, Robert Ocker's father had sold the car 3 days after Lori Ocker disappeared. It had changed hands 4 times in the month since Ocker sold it. It was finally traced to its new owner, 90 miles away. Despite the fact that the car had been thoroughly cleaned prior to sale, the forensics team was able to raise clues from the vehicle. In a door gasket were strands of hair consistent with the victim's. It had pulp on the end, indicating that it didn't just fall out.
The question was, why would Lori Ocker's hair be there in a car not belonging to Robert Ocker, but belonging to the mother? We also had information that she seldom, if ever, was near that vehicle.
Gentlemen. Hello, Kurt.
Clue by clue, the circumstantial evidence was building against Robert Ocker.
The rear light configuration, this is a much...
But investigators knew that the case depended on identifying the vehicle on the tape.
Without any witnesses, our main witness in the case was the camera itself. Murder is not a spectator sport. You seldom get eyewitnesses to a murder.
Right.
Investigators tried the next best thing.
The original.
They reconstructed the crime using the Ocker's Chevy.
Have any other ATM photographs that we're
They positioned it in the parking lot to approximate the unknown car, and they taped it with the same camera and focus as the ATM image. Then, the two images were compared. The results were encouraging, but inadequate to snuff reasonable doubt. The tape from the ATM wasn't enough. Investigators knew they needed to enhance the image, but in 1989, enhancement technology was in its infancy. They didn't know if it was possible to clean up the video. Sakavage contacted Eastman Kodak for help. They suggested NASA. If anyone on the planet had the ability to turn fuzzy images into hard evidence, it would be the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization at Kennedy Space Center. Principal investigator Alan Tietjen is in charge of analyzing images from shuttle launches for evaluation or troubleshooting. When the Pennsylvania State Police contacted him, he knew that enhancing the ATM tape wasn't rocket science, but it was close.
The process was very much the same. The source material was different in that videotape from a ATM machine is poorer quality than what we normally deal with.
Tietjen knew the quality of the image was too poor to identify faces or the license plate. The best he could hope for was to identify the car model. The image was loaded into a computer, which converted it into a digital image made of dots of light called pixels. 512 pixels per line, 512 lines per image. The process took 5 days. The computer, governed by a set of mathematical equations, manipulates the pixels, enhancing the picture.
There is no human intervention directing a specific result. The mathematics determine the result.
Each set of equations produces a different outcome. Tietjen had to be meticulous in his methods. He was setting a precedent. Never before had video enhancement been used in a capital case. He devoted 3 weeks to enhancing the ATM video. Once he completed it, he set to work enhancing the police reconstruction video. He used the same parameters for both in order to demonstrate that the images were in fact enhanced and not altered. Even with enhancement, the car in the original video wasn't perfectly clear. To make their case, investigators hired an expert from General Motors to identify the make and model of the car. He identified it as a Chevy Celebrity, model year 1983 or 84. Robert Auker's mother drove a 1984 model. Sakavage had placed the Auker's car and Robert Auker at the crime scene. The image enhancement made his case. Based on the forensic evidence and the unambiguously enhanced images, Robert Auker was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of his estranged wife, Lori Auker. The landmark case also established image enhancement as a powerful tool in the crime fighter's arsenal.
There are video cameras all around us. So they're capturing images, and whenever anything significant happens, now police are going to those cameras to try and capture some critical evidence, and now they're using digital imaging to try and get it enhanced to a point where it's more reliable than it would have otherwise been.
Every murder investigation is like a puzzle. Solving it requires finding the right pieces. But in a case in the Philippines, investigators had the pieces they needed. They just didn't know how to fit them together. In the pre-dawn hours of February 25th, 1991, a disabled truck on a desolate road caught the eye of a taxi driver in Angeles City, the Philippines. He stopped to assist the driver. He realized he had no help to offer. The woman behind the wheel was dead. When police arrived, the key was still in the ignition. The driver was still strapped into her seat. She was an American. Officials at nearby Clark Air Base were notified.
Calling Central, this is Chief Gindon. Pwedeng pakidala dito ng mga pulis para ma-check natin itong babae nito mukhang tiga Clark Air Base.
Life on the base is tight-knit. The first investigator on the scene thought he recognized the truck and its driver, a master sergeant's wife named Julie Snodgrass.
Tim Davis.
Office of Special Investigations Regional Forensic Consultant Lieutenant Colonel Tim Davis was summoned.
As we approached the truck, one of the agents came over and said, "Sir, I think it's Julie." When I walked up to the truck and looked in, I just said, "Oh my God!" And you don't forget those kind of things. I will tell you that. You just don't.
As an Air Force wife, Julie was a friendly face at picnics and parties, which she attended with her husband, Joe, and sometimes their 2 young children.
She was a good gal to be around, friendly, never knew an enemy. That's what I had a problem with when I was at the scene, was that I'd just seen Julie 2 days before, and I'd ask her, hey, I told her she looked great. She's got this great glow in her eyes, this great smile, and it's tough.
The glove box had been ransacked, its contents spilled across the seat and onto the floor. Superficially, it looked like a robbery, but it was too violent for that. The victim had been stabbed more than 40 times.
This was an act of violence. This wasn't an act of, hey lady, give me your purse. I'm going to steal your truck. It wasn't anything like that. This was an act that was done clearly to kill Julie.
The truck was carefully transported to a garage at the base where it was swabbed for blood that might belong to the killer. Hair and fibers were also collected. The sample were sent to the Army Crime Lab at Camp Zama, Japan. The results were disappointing. None of the blood, fibers, or hair found in the car pointed to anyone other than the victim. Investigators hoped that more significant clues were still to be found. The truck was carefully enclosed in a tent and fumed with superglue vapor, which exposes latent fingerprints. Some partial prints were lifted from the dashboard. They didn't belong to Julie or Joe Snodgrass, but the Philippines had no system to match fingerprints with known felons. It was another dead end. Besides the brutality of the crime, one question kept nagging at Davis. What was the victim doing in that part of town, especially at that hour?
If Julie went somewhere, generally it was on base only. Very rarely did Julie ever go off base.
The victim's husband, Joe Snodgrass, was questioned about the night of the murder. It was an awkward situation. Joe was in charge of managing all the evidence collected from crimes involving Air Force personnel in the Philippines. Because of his personal connection, the murder of his wife was one case he was not cataloging.
Joe, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Where were you?
Snodgrass told investigators that he and Julie argued. She stormed out.
Well, that day I was out
He called
shopping
several
with
of
my
her
wife,
friends to see if they'd seen or heard from
we had
her.
a fight, and
He even
pretty
kept a
much fought the
log of
remainder
the
of
calls
day,
he'd
so
made.
around 10:30 she just
That
left.
level of attention to
So I
detail
just
raised
came back to the
suspicions.
If you're watching and you believe in the TV cop stuff, primarily one of the things that a guilty person does is keep a log of the phone calls. So you just think, oh come on, this is too obvious here, but he actually did.
Joe and Julie Snodgrass had a history of domestic problems. In fact, a year earlier, Julie had divorced Joe and moved back to the States with their children. Joe had convinced her to come back to him 1 month before her death.
Okay, what kind of job do you do?
To see if their relationship was souring once again, investigators spoke to their housekeeper.
And I take care of the children.
She was nervous and unable to offer any information about the Snodgrass' relationship.
Where you at?
Considering her daily interactions with the family, that seemed strange. Investigators had no evidence to justify their suspicions about Joe Snodgrass. Then, the housekeeper decided to come clean.
So, Lucy, what did you do?
Just as the investigation into the murder of Julie Snodgrass was hitting a wall, the timid young housekeeper broke the case open.
What did you do with the letter?
She admitted to having an affair with Joe Snodgrass. More than that, she told investigators that he had written her a letter asking her to hire her relatives to kill Julie Snodgrass.
He asked me to find somebody to kill her, and he wanted me to find...
She destroyed it. But her word was enough to get a warrant to search Joe's office.
Did you get to find your relative? What?
Investigators confiscated some handwritten letters and computer floppy disks from his office.
This is some. Yeah. We'll keep looking back here. Okay.
Then, as a matter of legal procedure, Snodgrass was called in to identify the items collected in order to establish ownership.
Nothing? What's that?
When presented with the floppy disks, Snodgrass suddenly lunged forward and pulled something out of his pocket.
We heard one of the agents call out he has a weapon, and at that time, a number of agents who were armed ran by us and ran to the interview room. And then it was determined at that point that Joe had a pair of scissors.
Snodgrass had concealed a pair of pinking shears.
He had grabbed the disc all in basically one motion. This was like flash second stuff. And Joe began to cut the disc up into pieces. This is evidence. This is not supposed to happen, but it did.
The discs obviously contained something incriminating.
That stuff.
Could their data be salvaged? Davis wasn't hopeful.
I mean, you've taken something that was intact and now it's in 20-some pieces, and in your mind, it's there in a sense becomes 23 more pieces of evidence. How do you deal with it?
That was the question of the hour. No one had ever dealt with anything quite like it before. He sent the fragments to the Department of Defense Computer Forensics Laboratory in Washington, D.C. They became the responsibility of Special Agent Jim Christie of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
From the time I got the initial phone call from the Philippines, we had all our computer crime investigators out trying to find someone who had a technique to recover the data, because no one had ever tried that before. You're gonna like this.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Those discs from the Philippines.
Not only were the discs cut up, each piece was crumpled as well.
Cool. No problem.
Christie shopped the discs to private companies, to other law enforcement agencies, to the FBI. Each politely declined, saying the task was impossible or staggeringly expensive.
So when my deputy, Ed Cutchins, and we drove around the Beltway, picked up our discs, and we're driving back around the Beltway, and coming back to the headquarters here, and Ed said, okay, you've let everybody else have a shot at this, you're going to let me have a shot. And I said, what are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to scotch tape them back together. And I won't tell you what I told him at that point.
They experimented with blank, formatted discs, cutting them, taping them back together, and slipping them into a drive to see if the data were still readable. The first attempt was disappointing.
So we turned it on, and I watched my disk drive bounce across the table for about 10-15 seconds till the read-write heads ripped off.
Before they tried again, investigators placed a second floppy underneath the taped floppy to cover up the seams. They saw their first glimmer of progress. The disk drive survived. But before they could apply the technique to the actual disk fragments, they had to flatten them out. Once again, brainstorming and intensive trial and error brought results. A soldering iron placed in a section of aluminum tubing provided the right amount of heat and pressure to flatten the fragile sheet. Once the segments were flattened, investigators had to try to read them. They knew they might only have one chance, so when putting the pieces together, they erred on the side of caution.
We're afraid that if we put them all together, that if one piece ripped and caught the head, it might tear up the other evidence. So we decided to create host diskettes, what we called host diskettes, for each piece.
Each fragment was spliced onto its own separate host diskette and read individually. 23 fragments, 23 host diskettes. One chance to catch a killer. Computer forensics experts in Washington, D.C. puzzled over how to assemble the pieces of the mutilated diskettes in order to solve a murder. Some of the fragments were so small, investigators didn't know how to align them on the disk. These more troublesome pieces were sprayed with a solution called Magna-C. The magnetic spray dries to a powder and reveals the magnetic tracks on the disk fragments. Once the fragment was properly aligned on the host diskette, the powder was brushed away. Finally, came time to read the fragments. To analyze and display the bits and pieces of data, investigators relied on a software package called AnaDisk, developed for law enforcement. AnaDisk kept a trail of the separate segments of data and displayed them on the screen so they could be combined. The pieces, in more ways than one, were falling into place. But the splices still caused problems. Information on a diskette is tightly packed. Whenever the disk drive head hit a splice, it lost contact with the disk and missed large chunks of data. For this high-tech problem, an assistant supplied a low-tech solution.
Well, what he did was he just put his finger on the head, just like you would put a penny or a coin on an old photograph if you got stuck. And by putting his finger on it and rereading that sector, the head didn't bounce and we were able to get more data.
Investigators found love letters Snodgrass wrote to his wife and to his mistress, along with letters to his insurance company requesting an increase in Julie Snodgrass's coverage. They also recovered information linking Joe to an elaborate black market scheme. But what they found next was akin to a signed confession.
We found a last paragraph of a letter talking about his girlfriend hiring the hitman, him asking his girlfriend to hire hitmen, which she did.
It had taken 5 weeks, but the DoD Forensics Lab had achieved what was thought to be impossible. They had resurrected data that enabled a brutal murder to be avenged, and in the process developed a set of procedures for others to follow. Experts said the cost could reach into the millions. They spent $131. The information they gathered was sent back to Lieutenant Colonel Davis in the Philippines.
For me? I'll tell you flat out, had we probably not had that, we'd have had a tougher case to prove. But with the documentation that was recovered from that disc, there was no mistake. We had Joe.
Investigators reconstructed the likely course of events that led up to the murder. Joe Snodgrass, who was very controlling of his wife, had convinced her to deliver some money he owed to one of his black market contacts. He told her to pick up 2 of his confederates and to drive them to the drop-off point. She complied. She didn't know that the men she picked up were the ones hired to murder her. They were the relatives of the Snodgrass' housekeeper. Trusting them, she drove to a secluded spot. Then they killed her.
Felix, can you tell us what happened that night?
I didn't, sorry, sir.
They confessed to the crime and received 20 years. The housekeeper received probation.
I'll do it this last time, but not anymore.
And for masterminding the crime, Joe Snodgrass received life in prison.
You never stop and think that you would end up investigating one of your own for murder or being involved in the conspiracy to commit murder. It never crosses your mind, not once.
The technology that simplifies our lives has also made it harder for us to pass unnoticed. In almost everything we do, we leave behind an electronic trail as solid as footprints and as individual as our own face. When a crime occurs unseen by human eyes, investigators can invoke an electronic witness. In Los Angeles, a serial killer eludes police for months. The Night Stalker strikes at random, kills at will. The terror he inspires is enormous. The clues he leaves are slight. But ultimately, they're all detectives have to track him down. Investigators at the scene of a strangling rely on an experimental technique to raise invisible clues. They have only one chance to get it right. If they fail, a killer will walk. Crime scenes can be misleading. They can hold plenty of secrets or next to nothing. Harvesting hidden clues is the first strike against the criminal. To catch him, detectives need to turn fleeting prints into lasting impressions. Despite their working familiarity with death, Los Angeles homicide investigators were chilled by the scene they encountered in the affluent community of Whittier on March 29, 1985. The ransacked condition of the house spoke of robbery as the primary motive. A VCR, video camera, and much of the couple's jewelry was taken. But the perpetrator also had a taste for blood. Vincent Zazzara had been killed by a .22 caliber bullet. His wife Maxine was shot in the head and mutilated. The forensics team went to work, but wouldn't find many clues. Though the killer had plundered the home with reckless abandon, he had taken care to protect his identity. Technicians dusting for fingerprints determined that the intruder had worn gloves. Whoever had committed these murders left few traces behind. The bullet slugs were too damaged to be of use. After hours of scouring the home for clues, detectives came up empty-handed. The killer, it appeared, had gotten away clean. But he hadn't covered all his tracks. Beneath an open window, detectives located his point of entry. Distinct footprints marked the soil. One of the two prints belonged to the homeowner, Vincent Zazzara. The other appeared to be the footwork of his killer. Technicians sprayed the print with a fixative, then poured plaster into the indentation. The shoe print was lifted from the ground and sent for analysis. At the sheriff's crime lab, criminalist Gerald Burke examined it.
I was asked to check pattern details, size, take measurements of the casts of the impressions, and to see what kind of information I could get from those shoe impressions with regard to manufacturer, make of the shoe, size of the shoe, things of that nature.
The more Burke could learn about the shoes, the better idea detectives would have about the man who filled them. Burke knew the cast was from an extremely large sneaker, but he couldn't determine what brand of shoe it was. In his years of experience, Burke had never come across a print like this. It wasn't in their reference library of tread patterns. He couldn't find it in shoe stores. It had to be a newly released model or an off-market brand. Either way, the print, like the spent bullets, led detectives to a dead end.
Well, I don't know, they're still pretty young.
Without a source of comparison, Burke's analysis couldn't move the investigation forward. The Zazzara murders weren't the only case that had the sheriff's office puzzled. At the same time, detectives were trying to make sense of a homicide that had occurred less than 2 weeks before, 5 miles away in Rosemead in LA County. Maria Hernandez arrived home late one night and came face to face with the barrel of a .22. Inside the condominium, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, heard the gunshot. She died almost instantly.
Can you tell me what happened?
Maria Hernandez had been lucky. The keys in her hand deflected the bullet. She played dead until the attacker left.
And the gun was right in my face.
She told investigators that the killer was a thin Hispanic man in his 20s, dressed all in black.
And I laid there. I just knew that I just needed to lay there.
He had black, bulging eyes, hollow cheeks, and rotting teeth.
Enough light to see.
Hernandez had no idea why he wanted her and her roommate dead.
How tall? Is he as tall as I am? Tall?
For a week, the case went nowhere. And then, in an equally random way, the Zazzaras were killed. The .22 caliber slugs from both crimes were sent to the ballistics lab for comparison. They were too distorted to positively link them to the same gun. Even so, Detective Gil Carrillo of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office drew a connection between the homicides.
We had Maria Hernandez, who's surviving victim in the Hernandez case. You have her giving us a physical description and a drawing of an individual that assaulted her. We have a particular caliber gun. In the Zazzara case, we have no physical description, but we have a shoe print. And we have the same caliber gun.
Not only did he see the two crimes as being connected, Carrillo believed they were part of a much bigger pattern. For weeks, violence had been on the rise in Los Angeles County, a 4,000 square mile area of 88 cities. Night after night throughout the county, the toll of murders, sexual assaults, and abductions grew. The media was in a frenzy, reporting crime after crime. And with each episode, the public's fear swelled. The crime lab worked overtime to process the evidence gathered at the scenes. They weren't coming up with much. Carrillo looked for a common thread in the spree of violence. Based on crime reports and conversations with witnesses, he forged a radical theory. His colleagues saw the crimes as LA's growing trend of violence. While they assumed that the crimes had several perpetrators, Carrillo believed they were all the work of a single man. But Carrillo was new to the homicide department. None of his colleagues bought his theory. Apart from the grotesque violence of the crimes, there was no common denominator to suggest they were committed by one man. The rookie's instinct defied conventional wisdom. The sheriff's department wouldn't entertain the idea of a serial killer until Carrillo could base his suspicion on fact.
And until you had enough physical evidence or conclusive evidence, it's difficult to sell everybody that one man was committing all the crimes that had been committed up until that time.
Before he could prove his theory, Carrillo needed a more definitive pattern to emerge. He wouldn't have to wait long. In the weeks following the Zazzara murders, 7 victims throughout Los Angeles County were wakened in their beds. Women were bound with handcuffs, thumb cuffs, or electrical cords before being sexually assaulted. Houses were turned upside down, valuables stolen. Suburban bedrooms were now the most dangerous place in Los Angeles, and everyone was sleeping lightly. In early June, just 3 blocks from the Zazzara's house, a deputy's wife was roused from her sleep. She thought she heard a window opening. Someone was in the house. Hearing the couple's movement, the prowler slipped away. The deputy called the sheriff's department. In the daylight, investigators found gouge marks where the prowler broke in. The deputy pointed investigators to the flower bed, where he'd covered some evidence with a shoebox. Beneath it was the imprint of a large athletic shoe. The waffle pattern was familiar. It looked just like the tread found outside the Zazzara's house. It was the break detectives had been waiting for. If this print matched the print found at the Zazzara murders, it would support Carrillo's theory that one man was stalking LA's neighborhoods. But if that were true, it meant that one lone killer had managed for 1 year to defy LA's best and brightest. Now that he had a basis for comparison, criminalist Gerald Burke examined the 2 plaster casts taken from the crime scenes. He determined the prints were made by shoes of the same model, but not necessarily by the exact same shoe. Because both prints were left in coarse dirt, Burke was unable to identify the subtle marks that make each shoe unique.
Things like little nicks and cuts and scratches, or something that can be used as an identification, more or less like a fingerprint in one shoe sole to another.
This was of little help to detectives. In a county of 7.5 million people, they could not track a man solely by his tread marks. But it was all they had to go on. And it kept showing up again and again. Since the Zazzara murders, the large waffle pattern was found in the mud outside a Monterey Park homicide and was stamped in blood inside the home of a severely beaten old woman in Monrovia. Burke had 3 casts and 1 shoe print to work with. The crimes remained unsolved. The shoe prints remained a mystery. Then, a summer intern casually walking by a lab table made a pivotal observation.
And she said, "Oh, that's an Avia." And everybody just stopped and looked at her and said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah, I got a pair in my trunk." So she goes to the trunk of her car and pulls out this pair of Avia shoes, and that's when everything broke loose.
Avia was a new brand, explaining why the department had no information on them. In order to learn everything they could about this shoe, investigators went to Avia headquarters in Portland, Oregon. The company's designer identified the model number of the shoe that made the print. Burke pressed for more information.
I asked him to be a little bit more specific, and he said that he actually designed that shoe, and that he had a patent on that particular shoe sole design, and that there were no other patterns that were close.
The pattern was from an aerobic shoe that had only been on the market for 4 months. Only 1,300 pairs had been manufactured. Avia provided Burke with a number of soles from the factory so that he could accurately determine the size of the shoe that left the print. The rate of motion and the texture of the ground can greatly distort the impression. The only way to size the shoe was to compare tread patterns. The pattern details on the sole increase as the shoe size increases.
Down here in the bottom of the shoe, actually the mid portion of the shoe, you'll see that there are a number of chevrons. And these chevrons actually increase in number with the increasing shoe size. And the plaster casts, although they weren't good enough quality to record the Avia logo, they were good enough quality to allow me to count these pattern elements, these pattern details.
After counting the lines on the plaster casts, Burke was able to identify every cast he had as coming from a size 11.5 shoe. When he examined the marketing material from the manufacturer, he realized what a crucial discovery he'd made. Of the 1,300 pairs of this model manufactured, only 6 had been shipped to Los Angeles. Of those 6, only 1 was an 11.5. Only a handful of men in the country owned size 11.5 Avias. Carrillo's improbable theory of a single killer was now glaringly real.
When you start throwing the odds of more than one person wearing that particular model and size of shoe, it becomes, it narrows it down quite a bit that not more than one person is committing the crimes. When you have physical descriptions coupled with physical shoe prints, you've got, I mean, that's a neon sign saying, "Come get me." That's one man.
One very dangerous man that required county-wide attention. And getting him wouldn't be easy. They didn't know who he was, but terror had a name. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker. The Sheriff's Department organized a task force of homicide detectives. Carrillo teamed up with Frank Salerno. From his experience hunting some of LA's most deadly serial killers, Salerno knew what kind of challenges they faced.
It's very frustrating. You know, there's one individual out there that's committing all these crimes, and very violent, serious crimes, and you want to bring it to an end as quickly as you can.
The task force started small, then swelled as evidence accumulated.
At one point, we had about 75 investigators working in the bureau at that time, and we were using 1/3 of them just to investigate the Night Stalker series.
The Night Stalker held Los Angeles in a reign of terror during the summer of 1985. Night after night, people were struck down in the place they used to feel safest, their own homes. Pressure to solve the case was tremendous. But until detectives like Gil Carrillo uncovered the Night Stalker's identity, they couldn't calm the panic.
Gun sales went up, burglar alarm systems went up. Everybody was locking their windows and doors during a very, very warm summer. And you're talking about something that just took over the entire county of Los Angeles.
Law enforcement took to the streets. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods where the Night Stalker had struck, hoping that someone recognized him. They found nothing but petrified residents, and they knew better than to go at night. After dark, people weren't opening their doors to anyone. Sergeant John Yarborough was responsible for collecting evidence connected to the crimes.
In one house, I found a couple who had abandoned sleeping in their bed. They'd created dummies in the bed. The husband was sleeping routinely in the garage, and the wife was sleeping behind a television with the portable telephone. I mean, that was the kind of fear and panic that developed over this case.
Whether he killed his victims or let them live seemed as random as the rest of his behavior. Those who survived his attacks described, as Maria Hernandez had, a tall man with bulging eyes. He was saturated in a rank, leathery odor.
How about the mouth?
With the help of an identikit, a staff artist created a likeness of the man who had attacked them.
Did he have a mustache, any facial hair?
Good. So good to you? Yeah, looks good. I think that's him. I think that's it.
Detectives knew what he looked like, but he thwarted every effort to find him. The Night Stalker's unpredictability made his next move impossible to anticipate. Most serial killers conform to a regimented routine. This one seemed to work at random. He hit neighborhoods all over Los Angeles. His victims, both men and women, varied in age, ethnicity, and economic background. His MO was all over the map.
What we had was a man that sometimes used a gun, sometimes used a knife, sometimes used blunt force trauma, some he raped, some he didn't, some he strangled, some he just stomped to death. Some he robbed, some he didn't.
The only thing he never changed was his shoes.
I'll tell you what, I'll lock down some things.
To track the Night Stalker, Gerald Burke had to become an expert in the killer's footwear. He was dispatched to any crime scene that seemed remotely linked to him.
Okay, that sounds good.
I was out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on one side of the county, and at 6 o'clock in the morning I would be called to another side of the county, and I was just all over the place.
And though detectives could track the killer by his shoe prints, they always lagged one step behind him. On July 5th, they followed his tracks to the posh community of Sierra Madre.
Dad!
That morning, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett woke up backwards in bed. She had a searing headache. While the Bennett family slept just feet away, the girl had been beaten near death with a tire iron. She remembered nothing about the attack, but the familiar calling card was there. Sergeant John Yarborough speculated that the killer had two reasons for wearing the same shoes over and over again. First, they were functional. They allowed him to move surreptitiously or run if he needed to. Secondly, they'd never let him down.
But psychologically, it may have been the good luck shoes. He always wore them. They were always successful. He was always able to do what he wanted to do when he was wearing these shoes, so they had a good feeling for him.
The brutality of the crimes advertised the killer's lack of remorse and his delight in causing death.
I would say that he's a very good example of the predator-type offender who clearly just does not care about the victims that he comes in contact with. And he achieves a degree of thrill from it. That motivates him. Now, is he intelligent and cunning and clever? Well, he was certainly clever enough.
The Night Stalker was crazy like a fox and just as hard to corner. The task force wasn't enough. If detectives were going to capture this serial killer, they needed to spread out. Investigators made a videotape for LA County's 63 police departments. On the tape, Carrillo detailed the evidence gathered from the crime scenes. The suspect was a young Hispanic male who always wore Avias. An expert cat burglar, it was impossible to tell if his primary motive was killing or robbery. As the body count grew, a few patterns emerged. He seemed to target yellow or beige houses. He sometimes drew pentagrams at the crime scene. But this information brought detectives no closer to identifying the horrible face that haunted Southern California. The violence reached a frenzy as the summer of 1985 wore on. By early August, the Night Stalker was suspected of killing 13 people and attacking 10 others. His activity in and around Los Angeles seemed to be accelerating. Law enforcement braced for his next assault. And then, nothing. For the first time in months, nights were passing peacefully. But not for long. On August 18th, the Night Stalker struck again, this time in San Francisco. Peter and Barbara Pan, a couple who lived in a yellow house, were found murdered. It was the typical pattern: forced entry in the middle of the night, brutal murders, pentagrams, and stolen valuables. The unpredictable Night Stalker had just expanded his territory by 380 miles. The entire state was now under his grip. Where he'd strike next, no one could predict. San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein called a press conference to calm the citywide hysteria. But she divulged sensitive forensic information detailing the sneakers and the ballistics findings. Detectives believed the Night Stalker was following his case in the media. All along, he had enjoyed toying with law enforcement. Now that he knew exactly what they had on him, the advantage was his. He was likely to change his MO, and he was sure to discard his signature footwear. But a few good things came out of the media hype. San Francisco newspapers publicized the items of jewelry stolen from the Pans. A $10,000 bounty was placed on the Night Stalker's head. Informants started coming out of the woodwork. An informant, Donna Myers, told police that a man named Rick from El Paso had given her a bracelet and some rings.
He was very tall.
Like the description of the Night Stalker, Rick had terrible teeth, smelled bad, and was always spouting off about the virtues of Satan.
About my length, very full.
Police learned his last name was Ramirez.
Probably dark brown to black.
Police now knew who he was, but they still had to find him. The Los Angeles phone book was full of men named Richard Ramirez. A fingerprint lifted from a stolen car at a crime scene pointed the finger of blame at a single suspect.
When Ramirez's name came up, they pulled all the Ramirez's that had been arrested, which there were numerous of them, Richard Ramirez's, and they physically checked it just like you would by eye and made that identification.
Once they determined which Ramirez they were after, surveillance personnel were deployed all over Los Angeles. They concentrated on places Ramirez was known to frequent. One of those places was the bus depot. Uniformed officers and undercover cops swarmed the station. But since they were looking for a man attempting to leave LA, they didn't pay attention to arriving passengers. Ramirez, returning from Tucson, spotted the undercover officers before they saw him. He slipped out of the bus terminal and went to an East LA bodega for some breakfast. He quickly realized that he was the center of attention. El Matador, they whispered, the killer. Police were called. The chase was on. Ramirez ran for his life along the 5 freeway.
He ran like a gazelle. He literally ran at a full sprint, probably a good 2-3 miles. Kept going, went over 10-foot sound walls, crossed 8 lanes of the 5 freeway right here.
The fugitive made his way into a residential neighborhood of East LA. He saw his only way out, but it wouldn't take him far. Police interceded. The man they protected from attack was the man they'd been hunting for months. Their prime suspect, Richard Ramirez. At the police station, all eyes moved toward his shoes. They weren't Avia's. The Night Stalker was too clever to wear those again, but they were size 11.5. It seemed they had their man, but they didn't have his shoes. As always, it appeared the Night Stalker remained one step ahead of them.
Pinky, let's see your pinky.
Both Carrillo and his partner Frank Salerno believed that Richard Ramirez was the Night Stalker, but they didn't have the notorious sneakers. To build their case, the detectives would need to carefully draw together the web of evidence. Their first task was to interview the suspect. His demeanor surprised them.
Very soft-spoken. For lack of a lot of education, he was well-spoken also. Probably the thing that sticks in my mind the most is when you walk into an interview room with a suspected killer, is you usually introduce yourself, you tell them who you are. And I walked in and sat down, he says, "You're Frank Salerno."
Ramirez knew of him from the Hillside Strangler case, involving a pair of high-profile serial killers Salerno helped nab 6 years earlier. Detectives learned that their suspect had a vast working knowledge of serial killers throughout history. He knew all of their names, their methods, and the details of their captures. He had followed the Night Stalker case in the media. Though he never admitted to any crimes, Ramirez engaged detectives in a conversation about LA's latest serial killer.
He would talk to us in the third person. I didn't do this, but the Night Stalker might have done this. And the Night Stalker might have done this and this, and what do you think he'd have done over here?
Ramirez never confessed, so investigators looked for hard evidence to tie Ramirez to the crime spree. Inside his wallet, they had found a claim ticket for a piece of luggage at the bus station. Everything was removed and photographed. The bag contained a revolver and several kinds of ammunition, including .22 caliber cartridges. The evidence was bagged for further analysis. The shells and slugs collected from various crime scenes were taken to the ballistics lab to compare against those taken from the bag. They matched. Also, Ramirez's fingerprints were found on some of the items, confirming that the bag and its contents belonged to him. Most of the Night Stalker's surviving victims picked him out of a lineup. The eyewitness accounts, ballistics, fingerprint, and shoe print evidence provided police with enough to arrest Ramirez for the Night Stalker crimes. 3 years after the arrest, the case finally went to trial. By this time, police suspected that he had killed 16 people and assaulted 11 others. The suspect made no show of repentance. During a preliminary hearing, he sported a pentagram on the palm of his hand. He waved it about, shouting, "Hail Satan." Though no size 11.5 Avia aerobic sneakers were recovered among Ramirez's belongings, it was the prints found in 8 of the crime scenes that held the case together. They formed an irrefutable physical link between the string of burglaries, rapes, and murders. Eyewitness testimony tied the man in court to other crimes, even when no print was present. The most expensive trial Los Angeles had yet seen came to a close after more than a year with a victory for the prosecution. In November 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death 19 times. Richard Ramirez was one of the most horrifying monsters to terrorize the country. But whether a killer takes many lives or only one, the motivation to kill remains the same. Murder is the ultimate selfish act. On September 2nd, 1990, in Des Moines, Iowa, William Helm and his brother stopped by the home of his estranged wife to pick up some tools. The house was locked. There was no sign of his wife. He could see their son playing unsupervised. He became alarmed.
Susan? Susan? Susan?
Then he found her in the bedroom. Helm called the police. Officers arrived to find a woman's nude body lying in bed. A blanket was pulled up to her chin. Susan Helm, a 24-year-old housewife, was last seen alive at 2 a.m. when neighbors picked up a child she'd been babysitting. The same clothes she'd been wearing the previous night were crumpled on the bedroom floor.
What time did you guys get here?
Police asked William Helm about his relationship with his wife. He told them they were separated and he had moved out. He said he had last seen her the day before when he dropped off their son. They learned through interviews with the couple's friends that there had been a history of domestic violence. A police report stated that William had assaulted Susan 9 months earlier. Nothing in the house seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of burglary. Captain James Trotter of the Des Moines Police Department led the investigation.
We have a routine that we go through on all crime scenes, particularly indoor crime scenes, and we start from the outside and work towards the center to preserve as much of the evidence and photograph it as we possibly can.
The forensics team methodically combed the house in search of the smallest clue as to what took place. Though the victim was nude, they found no evidence of sexual assault. Technicians couldn't find hair, fingerprints, or blood samples to link the killer to his crime. The ligature mark around her neck told of a brutal death by strangulation. Detectives formed some theories. Because of the way in which the body had been covered, they believed that the victim had been killed by someone she knew. Someone who cared enough to conceal her nudity from strangers.
Usually what happens is that after the crime has been committed, then they think, oh my God, somebody's going to see my wife or girlfriend or cousin or whatever the circumstance is, and they'll cover them up. So it's a good clue, simply that. It's just a clue to lead us in a direction in our investigation.
As the bedding was examined, they uncovered another clue. Beneath the blanket, the body had been placed on top of a sheet, and on that sheet was an oily mark that looked like a shoe print.
I think you might have some imprints on the carpet. That's why I want you to be
The
careful.
print wasn't distinct enough to be used for comparison, but it suggested that the body had been moved.
Walk up alongside of the bed if you could. Pull that sheet back just a tad.
And so we concluded from that more than likely someone stood on the bed and maybe pulled or lifted the body onto the bed.
Samples of the blood. Okay.
The oily shoe print was made by automotive grease, embedded with small metal fragments. William Helm welded mufflers for a living. Though the print made him the prime suspect, it would be difficult to build a case against him. The physical evidence, it seemed, would only prove something he'd already admitted, that he'd entered the home, gone into the bedroom, and found the body.
I was going to pick up my daughter, so I pulled up.
Helm was brought to the police station to make an official statement.
Walked up the walk.
Investigators tried to pin him down about any physical contact he may have had with the victim's body when he found her.
I knocked on the door, and then there was no
Helm
answer.
claimed that he hadn't moved the bedding at all. He'd only used his fingertips to check her pulse at the wrist and neck.
And so it was critical that we have some physical evidence, otherwise we were only going to have a circumstantial case and probably not anything that we could arrest anybody for.
Detectives hoped that the body would disclose the secrets that the rest of the house had been hiding. More than a shooting or stabbing, strangulation requires close contact with the victim. Surely the killer left something behind. Detectives used an alternative light source to search for hair or fibers. Again, they found nothing. Unless a substantial clue surfaced soon, there would be no way to catch this killer. As investigators finished their search of the crime scene, they realized that they were being watched. After leaving the police station, Helm had returned to the scene of the crime. He pulled a lawn chair out of his car and set up an observation post on the neighbor's lawn. Peculiar behavior for someone who just lost his spouse.
That type of interest is usually to spectators who don't know these people, and normally the family is somewhere else consoling one another.
You never touched your wife. You went directly.
Helm's detached interest in the case fueled detective suspicions.
Never touched your wife. No.
They asked him to come to the station for another interview.
But you want to know why?
After almost 2 hours of questioning, police obtained enough information to get a warrant to collect samples of his hair, saliva, blood, and handprints.
Okay, pull it up.
In order to prove that Helm had killed his wife, police would have to find evidence that he was the one who moved the body.
To me here.
If Trotter's team could find Helm's fingerprints on a portion of the victim's skin that had been beneath the blanket, they'd be able to test his story. But they faced a big obstacle. In the field, no one had ever successfully lifted finger or palm prints from a body before. Des Moines police had tried and failed 6 times before. At a crime scene, it is difficult to control the variables required for success. Proper timing, temperature, and humidity were crucial. The experimental technique to raise fingerprints from skin had only succeeded in laboratories. If they could make it work at a real crime scene, it would bring criminal investigation to a whole new level of precision. The technique relies upon superglue's ability to turn the human touch into a permanent imprint. Years ago, workers at a superglue factory noticed that if they weren't careful, they left their fingerprints on the glue packaging. And because of their exposure to the glue fumes, these fingerprints couldn't be wiped off. Vaporized superglue, or cyanoacrylate ester, adheres to the oil deposited by the human touch. It attaches to fingerprints on hard substances such as glass or metal, creating a thin shell over the ridged pattern. It actually seals the print under a layer of plastic. In most cases, this pattern can then be dusted and lifted with tape. But lifting a delicate print off a textured, oily surface like skin is a tricky procedure. If there were any prints on Susan Helm's body, they wouldn't survive a trip to the coroner's office. The slightest change in temperature or the lightest brush against the body could ruin them. The testing would have to be done where the body lay.
All we could see was maybe just
In the lab, the technique had succeeded only on prints less than 4 hours old. Susan Helm had been dead for more than 12 hours. But it was the only hope police had of tying the murderer to the crime. The first step was to build a tent around the victim. A plastic drop cloth was wrapped around the frame and secured. Temperature within the tent must be increased to speed the evaporation of the glue. In the field, it's difficult to control. Liquid superglue was placed in aluminum dishes and set on burners inside the tent. The glue was heated for 10 minutes until fumes filled the structure. Technicians allowed 30 minutes for the glue to set. After the fumes settled, technicians moved in. Whatever lay beneath the plastic would make or break the case. If they could find a good quality print, they might be able to catch a killer. But if history were any guide, they'd find only a degraded print or none at all. And that meant a killer would walk. The plastic was peeled back from the body. Technicians searched for the ridges of a human fingerprint with a halogen flashlight. Shining the light at an angle helps the prints stand out. Passing over the lower portion of the victim's abdomen, the light revealed a pattern. It wasn't a fingerprint. It was larger and more distinct than they could have imagined. The print from practically an entire hand. The potential proof was there for the investigators to see. But success still seemed just beyond their grasp. For the first time in forensic history, scientists had been able to coax a latent print from a human body outside of the laboratory. But collecting the print would be another matter. Lifting it with tape would likely destroy it. Scientists needed to lift the print photographically. The photographed print from the victim's belly was delivered to the Des Moines Police Department Crime Lab, where it was compared to the print taken from William Helm. When comparing two fingerprints, identification technicians use a computer to look for matching patterns. Because palm prints are so intricate, technician Jerry Wilson had to make the comparison manually. The time-consuming task requires him to pinpoint areas where ridges join, diverge, or form dots.
The ridge on the outside.
Using those patterns as reference points, Wilson compares the prints for similarities.
And we look for these same identical points in the same relative unit space in each between the latent and the ink print, and the same amount of intervening ridges. And we also look for discrepancies, because if there's unexplained discrepancies, then you have to either eliminate the print altogether or explain why there is a discrepancy.
Technicians found no such discrepancies between the prints. Instead, they identified a highly unusual formation on both.
There was a double loop formation in the palm print, which is very unusual.
Go ahead, zoom in
And
a
that
bit
helped
more.
to locate the pattern
A little
area
more.
and made the comparison much easier
bit
between the
more.
inked and the
Good.
latent print.
Right here we've got an upward ending ridge.
Wilson can call two prints a match if they share 8 common reference
Ending ridge
points.
right there.
In the Helm case, technicians stopped counting
This
at
is kind of
90.
up in the interdigital area, so we got two delta
It was one of the most
formations.
obvious matches their office had ever come across.
There.
The discovery of William Helm's palm print on his dead wife's belly proved he was lying. He was the one who placed her into bed. It seemed police had caught the killer with a drop of glue. But to make a conviction stick, they needed to connect him directly to the murderous act. The victim wasn't strangled with bare hands. The killer had used a length of wire. Police had enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Helm's apartment. There, they found the final piece of the puzzle. The garrote, a piano wire stretched between 2 wooden handles, has only one purpose: strangulation. Though tests in the lab showed no trace evidence on the wire, its gauge was consistent with the marks on the victim's neck. Trotter pieced together a likely scenario of the murder. On the morning she was killed, Susan and William Helm had argued for the last time. William became enraged and took her life. He tried to cover his deed with a blanket, but the persistence and methodical attention to detail of the Des Moines Police Department produced the clue that marked him as a killer. William Helm was convicted of first-degree murder in the strangling death of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The forensic evidence in this case was extremely important because of the lack of witnesses and blood and all those other kinds of things that you can typically use to prove your case. So the fingerprint, the palm print in this case was the turning point for us.
By making sense of obscure prints, forensic scientists helped expose the crimes of Richard Ramirez and William Helm. Thanks to advances in technology, murderers like them can no longer escape the lasting impressions they leave behind. In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head.
What's wrong with him? Tell me, is he gonna be okay?
He was pronounced dead at the scene.
He's my husband. Can you tell me anything?
Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
Could have a seat right here, please?
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's
If I
house,
get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am?
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is,
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hands, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something. What'd you hear?
Stan picked up his gun, and the two went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him. She dialed 911.
Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, it irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is maybe...
I got some lady captain.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. She calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow. And possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Spear needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Speer spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case. Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Speer's theory, but even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos. He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. She was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over and take some pictures of that?
Definitely a lot of evidence. But the guy couldn't even digest it.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions.
Taking a sample.
It revealed that Plants suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Well, sure. Go
The beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz. It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage, her financial situation, any enemies her husband may have had. Her answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation. It began to look as though Plantz may have been the victim of a random act of violence. Gibson persisted in the investigation.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plantz's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plantz was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plantz? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimble. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimble was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plantz to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plantz planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug. It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below. They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled bloodstains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plantz's home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimball's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek had swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plantz's home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police.
Carpet in. We're going to get the washcloth and jeans.
There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plantz. Only then would Bryson and McKimball's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
But some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans, then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human anti-serum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plantz's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plantz's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimble, the murder occurred at Plantz's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plantz. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plantz's home, just as Bryson and McKimble had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plantz knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimble. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plantz's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I've got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plantz. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made 2 purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plantz had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plantz came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimble, were already there, waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the 2 men put the victim's body into his truck. Drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The 3 conspired to kill Mr. Plantz for the insurance money. McKimble did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other 2 were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plantz and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimble received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You can make a right.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the Woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link.
The 2 pieces of chain link recovered from
The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his 2 older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parents' death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crutchley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. 2 former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hommick, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hommick had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hommick had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, "What are you going to do if he comes around?" And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hommick revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hommick in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hommick could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hommick, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hommick was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hommick's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hammack's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hammacks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hammack's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hammack's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. Investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hammack to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hammack was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hammack's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hammack wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hammack from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stri pattern. What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stri patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hammack to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hammacks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hammack's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit.
Sorry.
That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neal and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neal and Stewart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neal and Stewart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hommick, life without parole, and Steve Hommick, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale.